At my sister's wedding, I was given a neon wristband. The usher said, "This means you're not allowed in the reception hall." Her bridesmaid snickered. "It's for non-essential guests." I looked around. Even her hairstylist got in. So I walked over to the gift table, took back the envelope with the $7,000 check, and said, "Good thing this wasn't essential either." She came running after me, yelling my name in front of the guests. I, 29M, stood outside the church watching my sister's perfect wedding day unfold, holding a neon orange wristband that felt like a scarlet letter in my palm. The usher, some college friend of hers I'd never met, had handed it to me with barely concealed smugness, explaining that it meant I couldn't enter the reception hall. Only essential guests were allowed inside for the ceremony and reception. Essential guests. The words echoed in my head as I watched distant cousins I hadn't seen in years walk past me into the church, their pale green wristbands catching the afternoon sunlight. My sister's hairdresser brushed by me, flashing her green band like a VIP pass. Even the photographer's assistant got one. But not me, her only brother. The bridesmaid who'd been standing nearby when the usher delivered my humiliation had let out a small laugh, not bothering to lower her voice when she remarked to her friend that orange bands were for non-essential guests. The way she said it, like I was some distant acquaintance who'd crashed the wedding, made my stomach clench with a familiar childhood rage. I should have seen this coming. My relationship with my sister had been deteriorating for months, ever since she got engaged and started planning what she called her dream wedding. Every conversation became about costs, about keeping things intimate, about how she couldn't afford to invite everyone she wanted. Yet somehow there was always room for her college roommates, her yoga instructor, and apparently every person who'd ever styled her hair. The divide had started small. She'd mentioned wanting a small wedding, just family and close friends. I'd supported that completely. But then the guest list kept growing in strange directions, while somehow contracting when it came to my side of things. My longtime girlfriend wasn't invited because my sister claimed she barely knew her, despite the fact that we'd been together for 3 years and she'd attended every family gathering. My 2 closest friends, who'd known our family since high school, didn't make the cut either. When I'd asked about it, my sister had gotten defensive, claiming that every bride had the right to choose her guest list. She'd thrown around phrases about her special day and how I should be supportive instead of making demands. But it wasn't about demands. It was about feeling like I mattered in her life at all. The orange wristband was apparently the final insult. I'd arrived at the church that morning expecting to be treated like family, only to discover I'd been categorized as overflow. Non-essential. The phrase kept repeating in my mind as I stood outside the church, watching through the windows as the ceremony began without me in attendance. I could see her at the altar in her white dress, radiant and beaming, surrounded by all the people who apparently mattered more than I did. The photographer was capturing every moment, preserving memories that I wouldn't be part of despite being her brother. My parents sat in the front row, and I wondered if they even knew about the wristband system or if they'd simply assumed I was inside somewhere. The ceremony lasted about 30 minutes, and when the doors opened, guests began filing out toward the reception venue next door. I watched them stream past me, green wristbands glinting in the sunlight, chattering excitedly about the beautiful ceremony and looking forward to the reception. Several people I recognized from family gatherings over the years walked past me without acknowledgement, either not recognizing me or not wanting to acknowledge the awkwardness of my exclusion. That's when I noticed the gift table. It sat just outside the reception hall entrance, adorned with white linens and covered with wrapped presents and envelopes. The happy couple would traditionally receive these gifts as a blessing for their new life together. I could see my envelope sitting there among dozens of others, thick with the check I'd written after careful consideration of my budget and my feelings for my sister despite our recent tensions. $7,000. It had represented a significant portion of my savings, money I'd been setting aside for months specifically for her wedding gift. I'd wanted to give her something meaningful, something that would help her and her new husband start their life together. The amount had stretched my finances, but I'd felt good about being generous with my only sister on her wedding day. Now, staring at that envelope while wearing my orange badge of non-essential status, the generosity felt like foolishness. I walked toward the gift table with steady steps. The woman monitoring the gifts, another bridesmaid I didn't recognize, was distracted by conversation with other guests. I reached across the table and picked up my envelope, recognizing my own handwriting immediately. The woman glanced at me, but didn't question what I was doing, probably assuming I was adjusting the placement or adding something to it. Instead, I slipped the envelope into my jacket pocket and walked away. The reception was in full swing by then, visible through the large windows of the hall. I could see my sister dancing with her new husband, surrounded by all her essential people. The photographer was capturing every smile, every laugh, every moment of joy that I'd been deemed unworthy to witness in person. That's when my phone buzzed. A text from my mother asking where I was, saying she'd been looking for me during the reception. I replied that I was outside, that I hadn't been allowed in. The dots appeared immediately as she typed back, asking what I meant. I sent her a photo of the orange wristband. Her response came quickly. She was coming outside to find me. I saw my mother emerge from the reception hall 5 minutes later, her face flushed with anger and confusion. She approached me with quick steps, demanding to know what had happened and why I wasn't inside celebrating with everyone else. I explained about the wristband system, about being categorized as non-essential, about watching the hairdresser and photographer's assistant get better access to my sister's wedding than I did. My mother's expression shifted from confusion to horror to fury in the span of seconds. She told me this was absolutely unacceptable, that there had to be some mistake. She was going to talk to my sister immediately to sort this out. But I stopped her. I told her it wasn't a mistake. This was exactly what my sister had intended. She'd found a way to exclude me while maintaining plausible deniability, making it seem like a venue limitation rather than a personal slight. The orange wristband was her way of telling me exactly how she felt about our relationship without having to say the words directly. My mother protested that my sister loved me, that this had to be some kind of misunderstanding or poor planning. But I'd been watching the pattern for months. This was just the culmination of a long process of pushing me out of her life, while making it seem like circumstances beyond her control. That's when I told my mother about the gift. Her eyes widened when I mentioned the amount, and she immediately understood why I'd taken it back. $7,000 for someone who considered me non-essential was indeed excessive. She didn't argue with my decision, though I could see the sadness in her eyes at how the day had devolved. We stood outside together for another 20 minutes, watching through the windows as the reception continued. I could see my sister mingling with her guests, posing for photos, and enjoying her perfect day with all the people who'd made the cut for her inner circle. That's when she noticed we were missing. I saw her scanning the room, probably looking for us for photos or some other wedding tradition. When she couldn't spot us inside, she must have asked someone, because within minutes she was heading for the exit with a confused expression on her face. She emerged from the reception hall still in her wedding dress, looking around until she spotted us near the parking area. Her expression immediately shifted to alarm when she saw my mother's stern face and my obvious absence from the celebration. She approached us asking what was wrong and why we weren't inside dancing. My mother held up the orange wristband, her voice tight with controlled anger as she asked my sister to explain what this meant and why her son had been excluded from his own sister's wedding reception. I watched my sister's face cycle through several emotions as the reality of the situation sank in. First confusion, then recognition, then something that looked almost like panic. She began explaining that the venue had capacity limitations, that they'd had to make difficult choices about seating, that the wristband system was just a way to manage the space constraints. But my mother wasn't buying it. She pointed out that the hairdresser was inside, that college friends she'd met once were inside, that people who barely knew our family had been given green wristbands while I'd been marked as non-essential. My sister's explanations became more frantic, insisting that I was misunderstanding the situation, that the orange wristband didn't mean what I thought it meant. But when my mother asked her directly to define what the orange wristband was for, my sister couldn't give a satisfactory answer without admitting that it was exactly what the bridesmaid had said, for non-essential guests. That's when I told her about the gift. The color drained from her face when I mentioned taking back the envelope from the gift table. She asked what I meant, her voice rising slightly with panic. I explained calmly that since I was apparently non-essential to her wedding celebration, my financial contribution was probably non-essential too. She demanded to know how much had been in the envelope, and when I told her, she actually staggered backward. $7,000 represented a significant portion of what she and her new husband had been counting on to help with their honeymoon and new apartment expenses. I knew from previous conversations that wedding gifts were factoring heavily into their immediate financial planning. The panic in her eyes was immediate and obvious. She began insisting that I'd misunderstood everything, that of course I was essential, that the wristband system had been poorly explained to me. She begged me to come back inside, to rejoin the reception, to be part of the celebration. But it was too late for that. The damage had been done the moment someone had placed that orange wristband in my palm and told me I wasn't important enough to witness my sister's wedding alongside everyone else she'd chosen to include. I told her calmly that I hoped she enjoyed the rest of her reception with all her essential people. I wished her well in her marriage and turned to leave. That's when she started shouting my name. Her voice carried across the parking area and drew the attention of guests who were stepping outside for air or smoke breaks. She was calling after me desperately, her wedding dress trailing behind her as she followed me toward my car. The scene was drawing stares and whispers from her carefully curated guest list. I could hear the desperation in her voice as she begged me not to leave, not to ruin her wedding day. But that struck me as particularly ironic, since she'd already ruined it for me hours earlier with her categorization system. I wasn't ruining anything by refusing to pretend that being marked as non-essential was acceptable treatment from my own sister. Her new husband appeared behind her, probably sent by concerned guests who'd witnessed the commotion. He looked confused and frustrated, clearly not understanding why his bride was chasing her brother through a parking lot on their wedding day. I could see other family members starting to emerge from the reception, drawn by the unusual scene. My sister continued calling after me, her voice becoming more desperate as I reached my car. She was promising that there had been a misunderstanding, that she'd fix everything, that I needed to come back inside and celebrate with everyone. But her promises rang hollow after hours of being treated like an afterthought at my own sister's wedding. I got into my car and drove away while she stood in the parking lot in her wedding dress, still calling my name with increasing desperation. In my rearview mirror, I could see her new husband trying to comfort her while curious guests gathered around, probably wondering what drama had unfolded to cause such a scene. Update 1. The fallout started immediately. My phone began ringing before I even made it home, first from my mother, then from other family members who'd witnessed the parking lot confrontation. Everyone wanted to know what had happened and why I'd left my sister's wedding in such a dramatic fashion. I explained the situation calmly to each person who called. The wristband system, the categorization as non-essential, watching peripheral acquaintances get better treatment than family members. Most people were horrified when they understood what had actually happened, though a few seemed to think I should have handled it differently. My sister didn't call that night, probably too busy dealing with the aftermath of the scene at her reception. But she texted the next morning, a long message apologizing for the misunderstanding and begging me to deposit the check so she and her husband could pay for their honeymoon. She insisted that the wristband thing had been poorly implemented and that I'd always been essential to her. But actions speak louder than words, and her actions had been clear. I'd been systematically excluded from meaningful participation in her wedding while watching strangers get VIP treatment. The orange wristband had just been the visible symbol of how she actually felt about our relationship. I didn't respond to her text. Update 2. 2 weeks later, my sister called me directly. Her voice was strained, and she was clearly stressed about their financial situation. Apparently, the wedding gifts hadn't totaled what they'd expected, and without my $7,000 contribution, they were struggling to pay for their honeymoon and apartment deposits. She apologized again for the wedding incident, claiming that the wedding planner had implemented the wristband system incorrectly and that she'd been too busy with wedding day preparations to notice the problem. She insisted that she'd never intended for me to feel excluded and begged me to understand that it had all been a terrible mistake. But I'd had 2 weeks to think about it, and the more I reflected, the more I realized this hadn't been an isolated incident. It had been the culmination of months of being marginalized and excluded from important aspects of her wedding planning and celebration. The orange wristband had just been the most visible symbol of a pattern I'd been ignoring. I told her that I hoped she and her husband could work out their financial situation, but that my gift had been contingent on being treated like family at her wedding. Since I'd been categorized as non-essential, my contribution had been similarly non-essential. She began crying during the phone call, telling me I was ruining her marriage before it even started, that I was being vindictive and cruel. But I reminded her that I'd been nothing but supportive and generous throughout her engagement, only to be publicly humiliated at her wedding in front of extended family and friends. The conversation ended with her hanging up on me. Update 3. My parents got involved after that, trying to mediate between us. They understood why I'd been hurt and agreed that the wristband system had been inappropriate, but they also wanted me to consider the impact on my sister's marriage and financial situation. I appreciated their position, but I also pointed out that my sister had made her choices deliberately. She'd chosen to prioritize peripheral people over family, to create a system that publicly ranked her wedding guests, and to exclude me from meaningful participation in her celebration. The financial consequences were the natural result of those choices. My mother suggested that perhaps I could give my sister a smaller gift as a compromise, something that acknowledged the relationship while also reflecting my feelings about how I'd been treated. But I felt that would send the wrong message, suggesting that public humiliation of family members had some acceptable price point. The situation created tension throughout our extended family, with different relatives taking different sides. Some felt I was being too harsh, and that weddings are stressful times where mistakes happen. Others understood that the wristband incident represented something deeper about respect and family priorities. My sister eventually had to take out a small loan to cover the expenses she'd been counting on wedding gifts to handle. I felt bad about the financial stress, but I also felt it was important that actions have consequences, especially when those actions involve treating family members as disposable. 6 months later, we still barely speak. She sends occasional texts asking me to reconsider, usually timed around when she's facing financial pressure. But she's never actually acknowledged that her treatment of me was wrong, only that the misunderstanding had unfortunate consequences. I've come to realize that the orange wristband was actually a gift in disguise. It showed me clearly where I stood in my sister's priorities and saved me from continuing to invest emotional energy in a relationship that was fundamentally one-sided. Sometimes the most valuable thing someone can give you is clarity about how they really see you. The $7,000 is still in my savings account, waiting for someone who actually considers me essential to their life.